start the webinar. I am so excited to introduce everybody. Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the Greensboro History Museum's October webinar series, Discovering Piedmont Archaeology. My name is Catherine Johns. I am the tour coordinator and resource specialist for the Education Department at the Greensboro History Museum. During the October webinar, we will be joined by members of UNC Greensboro's Archaeology program from the Anthropology Department, and later by a member of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Today's conversation is made possible in part by the Greensboro History Museums, Inc., the City of Greensboro, and the Libraries Department. Any views or findings or recommendations expressed in today's program do not necessarily reflect those aforementioned entities. We are also extremely pleased to have our guests with us. Hello, everyone. If you'll take this time to view the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q/A icon. It should be right below here. By selecting this option, you can type in questions for our panelists. Once you've typed in your question, just hit the enter button and your keyboard to submit. We reserve the latter part of our program to field these questions, although if there is a particular question that might need to be asked sooner, I will ask it. Don't worry. This evening, we welcome our panelists for today's webinar, which will also be featured as an archive in our History Notes podcast at selection at a later date. At your convenience, please visit www.greensborohistory.org and select the tab Discover and Learn to hear the podcast when available. We also will be premiering this webinar tomorrow on the Greensboro History Museum YouTube channel at 5:30 p.m. And I believe we are also live streaming it. So if you want to rewatch or want to send this to someone else, the recording will be there on our YouTube channel, which is named the same thing as what we are at Greensboro History Museum. Today's presenter, I am very excited, is Professor Geoffrey Hughes. Geoffrey Hughes is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, a PhD candidate at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His dissertation research looks at how Moravian potters in Salem, North Carolina, use ceramic technology to balance their identities as both devout Christians and economically successful trade people. We are so happy to have you today.
Well, thank you for having me. All right, are we ready?
Oh, we are.
Okay. Well, I got my glasses, so I'm ready to go now too.
Perfect.
All right. So today, North Carolina is world famous for its pottery. It's a tradition that stretches back to the colonial period and even much earlier. Some of the state's most important pottery centers are located right here in the Piedmont region. One of those centers started with the Moravians, who settled a nearly 100,000 acre tract in what they called Wachovia in the 1750s. This is now located in Forsyth County. So who were the Moravians? Well, the Moravians were German-speaking Protestants who traced their origins to the followers of the 14th century priest Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake for heresy. They are likely the oldest Christian Protestant sect, since Hus himself predated Martin Luther and inspired what would become the Czech Reformation. His followers then went underground during the subsequent religious wars, only to resurface and begin to reorganize themselves when they found refuge on the estate of Count Zinzendorf in Saxony in 1722. From there, they quickly set out to proselytize throughout Europe, into the New World and beyond, and eventually they created a worldwide missionary network. In North Carolina, they purchased the Wachovia tract, which again is in the heart of what is now Forsyth County. And the enlarged section of this map shows the Moravian settlements within Wachovia. So you have Bethabara, which was established in 1753. Bethania was established in 1759. Salem in 1766, Friedberg in 1773, Friedland in 1780, and Hope was also established in 1780. Now, Hope would be the one congregation community where English was the official language. But our story for this evening focuses on Salem. Now, in Salem, the church owned and operated several businesses that supported both the local community and sold goods to non-Moravians throughout the backcountry of North Carolina. The most lucrative of these was the congregation-owned pottery, which opened in 1771. Now, the pottery was located at the north edge of town, and you can see here's the lot for the pottery. Directly below it, you have the lot that would become the potter's residence. Across the street, there was an open orchard field. Just above the pottery, there was a blacksmith shop. To the northwest, there was an outlying farm. And then to the northeast, you have the beginnings of God's Acre. This would be the congregation graveyard. Over time, the business grew and its reputation for quality wares sold at a reasonable price spread throughout the region. Now, when it comes to studying a craft like pottery making, it's sometimes easy to forget just how many people were involved in the process. Some scholars focus almost exclusively on the work of the master potter, attributing all of the finished wares to the work of a lone artist. However, we know from historic documents that Salem's congregation-owned pottery was a place where people from many different backgrounds and statuses worked. And this makes sense, given that the annual inventories of the trade show that the Moravians were making thousands of pieces of pottery year in and year out. Moravian pottery workers included indentured apprentices, wage labor journeymen, most of whom were Moravian, but from time to time, the pottery actually hosted and hired some non-Moravian journeymen. They consisted of neighboring day laborers and the enslaved potter Peter Oliver. Now, Peter Oliver went on to use some of the money that he earned from his work in the pottery to travel to Pennsylvania, where he petitioned for and was granted his freedom. Later, he returned to Salem, where he built a life for himself and his family on a nearby farm. With its success, the pottery was soon enlarged, expanding from its original location on the west side of Main Street to encompass the east side of the street as well. Moravian potters then built 3 dedicated kilns on the east side of the street: an experimental kiln and shed in 1793, and 2 industrial replacements, one in 1806 and another in 1811. Here's a portion of a map from 1822, and it shows the pottery and the 2 industrial kilns that were built across the street. Now, by combining both historical and archaeological data, we believe that this kiln was the kiln that was built in 1806, and this kiln was built in 1811. Now, since the founding of Old Salem in 1950, archaeologists have searched for evidence of these kilns with somewhat limited success. And that's where my research comes in. And of course, my research, I'm indebted to a number of archaeologists who worked looking for these kilns before me, specifically 4 archaeologists. So in the 1950s, Frank Albright looked for evidence of the kilns. He looked at lot 39 and lot 49. He didn't find any evidence of a kiln that's depicted on lot 39. However, he did surface collect several pieces of pottery, and it showed that they were in the right location to find evidence of the congregation pottery. Then Stanley South in the 1960s, he found an opening to a kiln that protruded onto lot 49 from lot 48. He found evidence of vessels that looked very similar to a number of types of pottery that were being made by British potters in Staffordshire and Leeds. He found hints of stoneware production as well. Specifically, he found pieces of kiln furniture that are often associated with the production of stoneware. And he found a number of vessels that were earthenware, but they were really high fired, so they were almost stoneware quality. Additionally, he found the remains of 6 Feyns ring bottles. Now, Feyns is a type of European ceramic where you add tin to the glaze. And in some cases, what you end up with is a piece of pottery that resembles porcelain because of the tin in the glaze. Then in the 1970s, John Clauser actually returned and did more in-depth work on lot 39. Now, he didn't find any evidence of the kiln, but he did find pieces of kiln furniture, and again, more fragments of faience. Ultimately, Clauser concluded that the kiln that was depicted on that map was likely destroyed by the basement of the Van Vleck house, a more recent building that was built over top of that location. So that would have been really the end of the story for lot 39 and its relationship to those kilns. However, during the reconstruction of the Van Vleck house in 1976, the construction crew, while they were working on the basement, came across what looked like the opening of a kiln. It also appeared that maybe the body, if there was a body that was intact, it was probably on the lot next door, lot 38. However, nobody could really do any investigation because at that time, lot 38 was private property. So what they ended up doing was they sealed up that opening as best they could, and then they continued with the reconstruction of the Van Vleck house. Then in 2007, Old Salem Museums and Gardens were able to purchase lot 38. And at that time, Old Salem's archaeologist, Michael Hartley, was able to go in, relocate that buried opening, and assess its condition. And what he concluded was that that opening that had been buried in 1976 was still in excellent shape. So that's where my project comes in. So the Lot 38 archaeology project, this was part of my dissertation research through the anthropology department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and hosted by the Department of Archaeology at Old Salem Museums and Gardens. Now, although ceramic scholars have written about the important role of Moravian potters and the role that they played in the development of North Carolina's Euro-American ceramic tradition, our understanding of early kiln design and production process in Salem before the 1820s is very limited. In Salem, the earliest kiln that has been excavated actually dates to after 1830. And this is a period after which the pottery went from a congregation-owned business to a private business. And that kiln was excavated by Michael Hartley, and it's the Schaffner-Krauss pottery kiln. So for my research project, I had a number of research questions, both big and small. Some of my small and very specific questions were things like, well, what was Salem's congregation-owned pottery like? How was it laid out? How was it organized? What kinds of kilns did they actually build? If I could answer those smaller questions, then maybe I could build up to some of the bigger questions. Questions like, how did potters negotiate their identities as both faithful Moravians and as citizens of an emerging United States? How did Salem's potters use technology to balance the needs of the theocratic town that they lived in with those of their non-Moravian neighbors and an expanding marketplace after the American Revolution? To be able to answer any of those questions, big or small, I would need evidence, and that's where the field work really comes in. So yes.
We had a quick question from the audience that I think actually is a pretty good one. They wanted to know, what is kiln furniture? Excellent.
Yeah. So kiln furniture would be all of the supporting pieces that you put into the kiln when you load all of the pottery. So they would be things that if you're going to take a number of ceramic vessels, you want to put it into the wear chamber and you need to stack those vessels. The kiln furniture would be things that you would put in between, like spacers, also protective items.
Okay.
Yeah, so that would be kiln furniture.
Interesting. All right, thank you.
All right, so turning to the field work. In order to answer any of those questions, big or small, I would need evidence. And I would get that evidence primarily from doing archaeological excavation. And the kinds of evidence I was looking for would be evidence of kiln design, evidence of technological experimentation, and evidence of landscape use and modification over time. So I've got an aerial photo, thanks in part to our friends from Google Earth. And what it shows is it shows an aerial photo of the congregation pottery lots today. So you've got lot 48, and the original workshop would have been located right about here. Lot 49, you have the potter's residence. And then across the street, you have lot 39 with the reconstruction of the Van Vleck house. And then lot 38, which is the lot that I really focused on. And what you'll notice is that in this aerial photo, there's a house that's standing there. That house was later removed by Old Salem Museums and Gardens prior to us doing any field work. So we knew that we had an opening to a kiln located right about here. And chances are the body of that kiln would be located here. So we actually started by looking at the other corner of the lot. And what we did was we dug a number of small little test units. They're like little squares that you dig, and you're looking for artifacts. You're looking for any evidence of, maybe in this case, pottery related structures. We wanted to make sure that there weren't any kilns that were located south of where we had a good idea that we already had one of those kilns. So we systematically went over this space, dug our little test units. We really didn't find any evidence of additional pottery related artifacts or structures. So the next thing we did in the summer of 2016, we began a block excavation over where we thought the body of that kiln would be located. And then finally, in the fall of 2018, we were actually really lucky, and we had someone from NC State come out and do a geophysical survey. And that included using ground penetrating radar and a magnetometer to look and basically peer under the ground without excavating and see if there were any anomalies, anything that was buried under the ground that might relate to pottery production, maybe outbuildings or even maybe large piles of broken pottery that were left over from the production process. And we also wanted to make sure that they covered the area that we had shovel tested, just to make sure that we didn't miss anything. basically, they didn't find any evidence of any additional pottery-related features or structures. So we then really just, this is our best evidence for pottery production on lot 38.
Geoffrey,
Yes.
with a shovel test, well, first, could you briefly describe what a shovel test is for our audience?
Yeah, so you're probably used to seeing maybe documentary films where they show an archaeologist and they're kind of like this photo here, where they've got a trowel and they have this big square open and they're doing this very detailed excavation.
Yes.
Well, a shovel test is kind of like that, but only in miniature. So you basically go out and you walk a straight line, and every so many feet or meters, you basically dig a small hole in the ground, and you're just testing to get a sense of, are there some buried artifacts there? Or maybe there's a buried feature that you might find. If you do find artifacts or what looks like a feature, then what you can do is you can always come back and expand that little hole and make it into one of these full-blown excavations.
Excellent. Perfect.
All right. So the project itself, the research on lot 38 was always intended to be a public archaeology project. So the excavation took place right next to the sidewalk on Main Street, which allowed the public to come and visit the site while we were working there. Visitors could stop by, they could ask questions, they could hear about the history of the site, they could see our latest discoveries, and they could learn more about the process of doing archaeology. With the help of a generous private donor, one summer we were even able to host a number of paid archaeology student interns from universities across the Southeast, and they were housed during that time by Old Salem. And inspired by a citizen science model, we were aided throughout the project by local community members who volunteered to excavate in the field and help process artifacts back in the lab. Now, ultimately, we uncovered the remains of two early pottery kilns. First, we found what was left of the small experimental kiln and shed that was built in 1793. Now, the southern half of that kiln and shed, we believe, was later destroyed by the construction of a general merchandise building in the 19th century. So, and you can see it here in this map overlay, where we've combined a later Sanborn fire insurance map showing the location of that general merchandise with a bird's eye view of our excavation. Then we uncovered one of the two industrial kilns. This kiln, we believe, was built in 1811. So these are the oldest pottery kilns that have been excavated in Salem, and they offer a glimpse into early Moravian kiln design and building techniques. Within the kilns themselves, we recovered a variety of ceramic artifacts. In addition to utilitarian pottery, we recovered fragments of traditional Germanic slipwares, refined earthenwares and figurines that were inspired by contemporary British potteries. We found fragments of faience, and we even found examples of stoneware. Now, although some references exist to Moravian-made stoneware in the historic documents, exactly what some of that stoneware may have looked like remained a mystery, at least until now. And here's a bird's eye view of our large excavation block. And this was made using 3D photogrammetry. So 3D photogrammetry is a relatively new mapping technique where you take a number of digital photographs and you run it through a computer program, and it stitches together all of those photos, and it creates a three-dimensional model of either an artifact or an area that you've excavated. And if you use it to map, the maps that you produce with 3D photogrammetry are up to a centimeter in accuracy. So in some cases, 3D photogrammetry is actually more accurate than a hand-drawn map. So let's take a look at what's left of the 1793 kiln and shed. And what you'll see is that we've uncovered the bottom of the builder's trench. So this would have been the very bottom of the wall for that kiln and shed. And then you'll also notice that we uncovered some other features, more recent features. So for example, we have an 1895 fence line. We've got large stones, some bricks, and then also post holes for that fence line. So while we were primarily interested in ceramic production and some of these early features, over time the landscape had been reused and modified for other uses. So when we came across other occupations, other evidence for reuse, even though that wasn't our primary focus, we always made sure that we recorded the evidence of landscape modification over time. So looking at the remains of the 1793 experimental kiln and shed in more detail, what we see is that we think this particular kiln and shed was demolished sometime between 1805 and 1806. And it was demolished to prepare the way for these industrial kilns. Based on the archaeology, it looks like a lot of the material from the kiln itself was probably reused. So when we excavated, we found layers and layers of debris. Some of this debris was full of plaster from the walls. We had destroyed and deconstructed wall debris on the sides. You can see this profile. We've just got layer after layer of material when they filled in the hole, and they just threw stuff in that old hole. You'll notice we've got all these little bright specks and spotches down here. This is potter's clay. And we also had a lot of ceramics, broken pieces of pottery that they threw in there as well. And every time we had bricks that looked like maybe they would fit together and would end up being a nice wall, well, we would find that that was actually mixed in with broken pieces of pottery. And so everything was disarticulated. It was all jumbled together. But what we did see is that you can see this layer right here. This layer runs all the way around and on top of what was left of the old kiln and shed. And this is actually a work surface. So this was compacted dirt, and it was compacted from people walking over it back and forth. And then within it, we found a number of pieces of pottery, but they were really small. They were like dime size or quarter size. So things that people had been walking on and crushing. And that basically capped the top of this demolished kiln and shed. And then, of course, over top of that, we had more landscaping fill. So in terms of the actual design for the 1793 kiln, we're not entirely sure, because it looks like when they were done with it, they probably went in, pulled out whatever bricks and stones they thought they could reuse to build another kiln and save the cost of building another kiln. And then they threw everything in that hole and filled it up. However, one thing that we did learn, what you'll notice is here's a surface. This is the original ground surface. And then you got this really nice straight vertical line that's cutting down into the clay subsoil. This goes down about 2 feet. And what it tells us is that when they built this experimental kiln and shed, they actually built a structure that was semi-subterranean. This is the first time that we've seen evidence of Moravian potters creating kilns in and around Salem that weren't just built on the ground surface. In this case, they're actually digging down into the subsoil and then they're building their kiln. And we think they did this probably for two reasons. One, you would get extra support with the subsoil on the sides. And two, it acts as insulation. So if you're going to start making something like stoneware that requires a higher temperature, having that extra insulation from a semi-subterranean kiln is going to help you produce higher temperatures and keep that heat in the kiln longer.
Geoffrey, is that what made it an experimental kiln? That they did it's partially subterranean?
Yeah, well, that's one of the innovations that we believe that they're doing, is that when you look at the historic records, they refer to this kiln as an experimental kiln. There are some records where they refer to it as the little Feyns kiln. And then we also know that they eventually start making stoneware, and this is the new kiln that they've made. So that's why I think that, it's a smaller kiln, but it's a kiln where they can experiment and they can try new techniques and try to create those higher temperatures that maybe the old earthenware kiln across the street just was simply not capable of producing a stoneware temperature.
And the bricks that made the experimental kiln, were those just normal bricks, or did they have some sort of tempering to them that made them unusual, like a fire brick?
Well, from what I can tell, they would have been bricks that the master potter would have been talking to the person in the community who is in charge of making bricks. So there would have been some specialization. And they wouldn't be necessarily the same size as masonry bricks. And there were a number of different sizes and shapes for bricks just for kilns. We know that the master potter did not fire his own bricks. There was a separate person in the community who was in charge of firing bricks and clay tiles for the roofs. But I'm pretty sure that the master potter probably went down to where they were firing those bricks and said something along the lines of, look, this is exactly what I want, and it better be up to snuff, because I've got a lot riding on this kiln and I don't want it to fall apart. Yeah,
that's right. That is exactly what I would hope a master potter would be very invested in what their experimental kiln would look like.
That's right. Yeah.
And those temperatures, how high does the kiln need to get to create stoneware?
Yeah, so we're looking right off the top of my head. I don't remember. And there's, of course, a range with any of these, whether it's earthenware or stoneware. Yeah, that just escapes me right now. But I can get that information for you.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So, it was a bit disappointing in terms of looking at the architectural design of the kiln, given that there really wasn't a whole lot that was left. However, in terms of the pottery that we saw coming out of this hole, we saw a whole range of things. So, for example, we had utilitarian earthenware. These would have been like things that you would use in the kitchen. You might use them for storage. So we saw examples of that. We also saw examples of very decorative Germanic trailed earthenwares, things with flowers, with plants on them, things like this particular piece. And of course, there were other examples. So we had decorative pieces with flowers. They often have sine waves, that kind of wavy pattern around the rim of the vessel. We had bowls with marbled slips. We also found a number of stub stem tobacco pipes. And we found these in bisque, where they were fired, but they weren't glazed. We found them made out of red clays and white clays. We found some examples with green lead glaze, like this one here. And all the pipes that we found in the 1793 kiln and shed, they were either plain, or more often they were what we call these Indian designs. So these are designs, and the face on them are designed to look like at least a European idea of what Native Americans may have looked like. So this kind of face, this is the kind of face that you might see on, say, a large map, and down at the bottom you have depictions of people in the New World. That's that kind of stylized view of what Europeans thought Native Americans would look like. We also found examples of what were called fine wares, things like feather edge. And the Moravians learned how to make feather edge patterns that were inspired by popular British forms when the Staffordshire potter William Ellis came to town and showed them how to make these. Moravians actually continued making some of these fine wares like feather edge into the 1830s, past when feather edge was really popular in the broader market. For example, we've got, this was excavated by Michael Hartley on lot 81, and this is from the Schaffner Kraus pottery. So these are examples from lot 38 when it was a church run pottery. And then this is an example from when it was a private run pottery. In 2015, we came back and we worked on lot 81 again, and we actually found part of a mold for one of these feather edged plates. So this is a tradition that started in the 1770s. It started and it became popular when it was a congregation-owned pottery. And it's something that then continued when it became a private pottery years later. So we also have the famous Feyns ring bottles. And Moravian potters started experimenting with faience after the arrival of Karl Eisenberg, who was a German potter. Eisenberg visited the pottery and he showed the Moravians how to make faience, and he even left a glaze recipe book for making faience in all kinds of colors. On the left, this is an example of one of these ring bottles that was excavated by Stanley South. He found that across the street on lot 49, and he found it in a small dump that was located under the addition to a pottery workshop. We found examples on lot 38, and based on the color, we're thinking they're using the same recipe. And in fact, they may actually come from the same load or firing of these ring bottles.
Oh, we have a whole series of questions.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. The first one is, how did they do things like calcined materials without it going everywhere or getting it full of ash?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
They asked, how do they do things like calcined materials without it going everywhere or getting it full of ash? I think they were wondering how some of the glazing doesn't make everything ashy eventually while going into the firing, I think.
Okay. Well, so part of that, I'm assuming, would have to do with when you're actually preparing the glaze and your, I guess, dry to wet ratio, and being able to have it wet enough that you keep that dry material from kind of flying everywhere. And then, let's see if I can understand that question. We do know, especially when it comes to adding things like lead as a flux in the glaze, obviously lead is carcinogenic.
Yes.
And it's very dangerous. But the thing is, people have been using lead in ceramics for quite a while, at least back to the Roman period. And people had an understanding that lead wasn't something that you really wanted to mess around with. And we actually read in the Moravian archives that at one point the church actually got involved between the master potter and one of the apprentices and said, this apprentice is rather sickly, rather ill, and we recommend that you actually move him from working with the glaze and move him into the workshop and have him work on throwing pottery on the wheel, because being exposed to this glaze is not good for his health. So the Moravians had a working understanding that you needed to be careful around these glazes, especially if you're going to add things like lead.
That makes sense. Our next question is actually a very good one for this whole series, which is, were the Moravians making pottery only for Moravian consumption, or were they selling it to non-Moravians as part of a market economy?
Yeah, so the answer is they were doing both. So they were certainly supplying their own communities, and then they were certainly selling to non-Moravians, people from the surrounding community. In some cases, they were actually, we know of one record where early on in Pythagoras, they sent a wagon load of pottery down to Fort Dobbs in exchange for lead from the fort. So we know that Moravian pottery is traveling. Later on, we have records where they're actually sending stub stem pipes and all of the stems, and they're shipping them up to Philadelphia to sell up in Philadelphia. So this Moravian pottery, it's getting around. And we know that certainly a lot of these, the introduced like British styles, the fine wares, feather edge, etc., that certainly would have appealed to the broader market. One line of interpretation has been that, well, they made all the British stuff for the non-Moravians, and then all the Moravians bought the kind of traditional Germanic ware and the utilitarian ware. I'm not sure that we have enough archaeological evidence comparing and really looking at consumption to be able to say that for sure, that Moravians weren't also buying some of these British inspired wares. So that's kind of the question. But yes, they were definitely selling to non-Moravians. That was a big part of their revenue. And overall, the revenue for all of those trades were meant to make the communities as self-sufficient as possible, and also to help fund their missionary work. So, and that missionary work out of Salem and Wachovia would have been primarily aimed at working with the Cherokee, working with the Creek. And then we also know that they had regular interactions with the Catawba as well. Yeah. So does that help to answer, or at least to partially address?
I think that covered it beautifully. I think that's about as that covers it perfectly for every aspect.
All right. Let's see. Okay, so faience. Now, obviously, we were aware of these ring bottles, and that they were faience ring bottles. But during my excavation, in addition to finding some bits and pieces of ring bottles, we also found other small pieces of pottery that, I would look at them in the field and I would think, I think this might be faience, but it's different than what I've seen. And then the other thing that complicates it is a lot of what I'm seeing are kind of rejected pieces. So they're not the perfect example of a particular or any particular type of pottery. So in some cases, like this sherd right here, the glaze is very, very thin. And typically I don't see a glaze that thin when it comes to faience. Usually it's a thicker glaze. And when it breaks, it will actually do what we call spalling. And it breaks more like if you were to peel a hard-boiled egg. You get these big flakes that come off of it. And you can certainly see, like in this example, here's the paste or the body of the ceramic, and then the glaze just kind of lays on top. And it's fairly thick when you look at it in profile. But I had some thin pieces, and I also had pieces that were in different colors, things that I wasn't used to seeing. And I suspected, well, maybe they're faience, but I really don't know for sure. And I don't know that I can just trust my eyes. So I was really fortunate. And I took a couple samples back to Chapel Hill, back to the research labs of archaeology. And fortunately, David Cranford, who's now with the Office of State Archaeology, he was a graduate student then, and this was kind of like one of his specialties. And so he did me a favor and he ran samples on these two, and we got the readouts on the chemical makeup. And lo and behold, there was enough tin that showed up with these samples that we could say, yeah, we think that this is probably faience. So now I have a better eye based on the chemical makeup of these particular sherds. I feel more confident in my ability to identify odd pieces of faience just by looking at them. The other thing that we find at the site is we find more evidence of experimentation. And this is the case where we're looking at a particular type or form of pottery that are porringers. Sometimes they're called pint or half pint cups. And basically what they are is they're kind of a bulbous mug. And the American examples usually have one handle. European examples often have two handles, but they're basically really good for holding things like soups and stews. And this was a very popular form. I find lots and lots of pieces of porringers in these kilns. And what we see is that they're making porringers with all different types of surface treatments or surface decorations. So we've got examples where they're using a green lead glaze. We also find examples in tortoiseshell. And tortoiseshell would be one of those British-inspired decorative techniques that was really popular among non-Moravians. But here you've got a vessel form that I'm pretty sure most Moravians were using as well. So they're experimenting with the decoration with a known vessel form that they've been making ever since they were doing pottery in the early days in Bethabara. And then you have stoneware versions of porringers. And this particular one, it has a very, very fine salt glaze. And they're using salt as the glaze because it will stand up to those higher temperatures. Whereas lead, if it was exposed to that higher temperature, lead is basically going to break down and potentially boil off. But the salt will actually stand up to that higher temperature. And what you see in the body, in the inside or the fabric of that ceramic, is a greater degree of what we call vitrification. It's basically melting. And what you end up with is a very hard ceramic. So stoneware is great for things like storage vessels, large crocks, anything that you really want to stand up, basically take a licking and keep on ticking, as they say. So they're making salt glazed porringers. And we also see attempts at making salt glazed stoneware. So for example, this particular shirt, again, you got that really fine salt glazing on the exterior. But then when you look at the fabric, this is much more porous. It's more like an earthenware. It has not vitrified to the extent that a true stoneware would. So for whatever reason, that kiln and that particular firing, it just didn't get hot enough. But we see this evidence of experimenting. And they're experimenting with new decorations, new exteriors, but they're using a vessel form that they're very comfortable with. So they're using a traditional vessel form, and then kind of like doing an experiment, you're trying to kind of control the different variables. So one of the variables they can control for is the size and shape of the vessel. And then they'll experiment with, well, what kind of decoration, what kind of surface treatment do we want to use? And then can we push this and move it from an earthenware to a stoneware?
A question that somebody threw out was also, how do you know that a kiln or a group who were creating kiln were getting to those, essentially, how do you know that their experiments were going well?
Yeah. How do you know that their experiments are going well? Okay. So, well, first of all, there are those pieces that have actually survived and that maybe people still have. Pieces that antiques collectors are able to find, or that survive and they're in museums. So that would be like your best direct evidence.
Yes.
Then you could also look at some of the historic documents related to pottery. What they're doing in Salem is they're producing an annual inventory every year of what pieces that they have in stock, how many pieces they have. And in some cases, they actually enumerated, so many pieces of stoneware crocks, so many pieces of this vessel form or that vessel form. So that would be another type of evidence that would say, okay, the experimentation is probably successful, even though we don't see the finished vessel. We have a document that is saying, yeah, we're doing stoneware, and not only are we able to do it, we're actually selling it, and we have X number of stoneware pots in our pottery. When it comes to finding these reject pieces of pottery, that's where it gets tricky.
Yeah.
So, most of those reject pieces, these are pieces that we call wasters. They're wasted pieces. And for whatever reason, maybe there was a firing flaw. Maybe the kiln got too hot too quickly and the piece shattered. Maybe the kiln cooled off too quickly and it shattered. And then you're left with these broken pieces. Some of those pieces will actually have evidence of the firing flaw that made it a bad piece. And in some cases, maybe it's not what they were using on the exterior of the pot, but you have evidence that maybe there were too many pieces of stone or rock or inclusion in that pottery, and that's where the problem was. In other cases, you have pieces of pottery that you inspect and you say, well, I can't see that there's any flaw in this whatsoever.
Mhm.
Yet the mere fact that it was in this dump
Mhm.
of broken pottery says that it was there for some reason.
Mhm.
We just don't know what that reason was.
Yeah.
So those would be kind of the three lines of evidence that I would use in trying to determine whether you had successful experimentation or not.
That makes sense.
Good?
Excellent.
Okay, excellent. All right, some of the other things that we found examples of molded figurines and even animal bottles. Again, this would have been inspired by some of the British potteries. We found a molded sheep figurine, and often in the annual inventories of the pottery, these are listed under the entry toy sheep and dogs. The other thing that we find is we find bits and pieces of different animal bottles. And again, this would have been very popular with some of the British inspired forms. But what we see in Salem is that they're making bottles and some of these figurines using the wildlife that they would have seen in North Carolina. So we have turtle bottles, bear bottles, otters, and squirrels. All right, so let's take a look now at the 1811 kiln. And this is probably our best evidence for early kiln construction and what the Moravians may be doing a little differently than some of the surrounding potters. This was built in 1811, and we think it was probably used all the way up until 1831. So we'll zoom in here. All right, so that opening that was uncovered in 1976, that would be located probably right about where my laser pointer is. And then we worked south of that opening to uncover and see what was on lot 38. And one of the things that we found was this brick-lined series of tunnels. And at the bottom, right above that brick floor, we had a nice thick layer of ash. So evidence that this is the firing end. This is where they would have set the fire in the kiln to bake the pottery. And what we found was that not only did we have one tunnel, we actually had two tunnels. So about halfway in, we had this small tunnel that was about 5 feet long. On the outside of that small tunnel, we had a larger tunnel that was 10 feet long. And it was basically like you've got this larger tunnel and it was like a sleeve over the smaller internal tunnel. When you look at that tunnel, at the face of the tunnel, it's only about 1.9 feet high and 2.2 feet wide. So this is a pretty small opening. You would have to be on your hands and knees to be able to get into this thing. When we look at the other end over here, this is where that tunnel opens up into the wear chamber, or the place where they actually stacked all the pottery. And what we found at this end is we had a bag wall. So this is a temporary wall that you would set up, and it basically serves as kind of a barrier between the fire and where you stack all of your pottery. And it does a couple of things. One, it creates a barrier between all the ash that's produced in that fire, and it keeps most of that ash from coming into the wear chamber and coating the pieces of pottery that you've made. The other thing you can do with it, depending on how high you build that bag wall, or if you put openings in the bag wall, you can actually create a draft, and you can use it like a flue system to draw air in. The other thing that we noticed when we compared the interior walls of that small tube, that small tunnel, we noticed that it actually reduced by about 25% from the opening until where it hit the wear chamber. So basically what they've done with this little interior tunnel, they've created a funnel. And so you can imagine you've got this big fire that's going, and then all of that hot air, all of that heat has to then be compressed through this funnel, and it's going to raise the temperature before it hits the wear chamber and before it hits your pottery. So looking at the 1811 kiln and what's left of it from a bird's eye view, we'll do kind of a walkthrough. So what you have is you've got that original opening, and then it looks like there's maybe 1 or 2 brick steps down into the tunnel. You've got that 5-foot long tunnel that's like basically a funnel. And then you've got the bag wall separating the fire from the wear chamber where all of the pottery would have been stacked. Then we found that exterior tunnel. And one of the interesting things is over here, that exterior tunnel is pretty well intact. But over here, it's like somebody went in and removed all those bricks. And we think what they're doing is that in 1831, they decided to shut down all the kilns on this side of the street, and they made a deal with the master potter at the time, who was going to take over the pottery and run it as a private business. The church said, okay, well, we will shut down these kilns and we'll build you a new kiln on your property. And so I think what they did was they went through and they decided, okay, are there any bricks, stones, etc., that we can use from this kiln? Are there any of those that we can recycle and build that new kiln? And so what you see is that these bricks here that would have been exposed to the direct heat of the fire, it looks like they've left those bricks in place. But all the bricks that were on the outside of this smaller tunnel, those have all been removed. So those would be bricks that were probably still usable because they hadn't faced the direct heat of the fire. There was that smaller tunnel that was in between. The other thing that we found was that there was a stone-lined builder's trench. And when we excavated it, this was full of kiln bricks. Most of those bricks were in really bad condition. They had been exposed to fire and they were at the point where they were kind of crumbling. And then we started finding these flat slabs of stone. And we found a number of flat slabs that had actually been laid inside this part of the tunnel. So it's like they were pulling and going through this area, picking out what they wanted to keep, and then throwing the rest away. That tunnel, or this brick line builder's trench, this is about 2.5 feet below the old ground surface. And this right here is the original ground surface. So again, they're building a kiln that is semi-subterranean, probably both for support and to build higher heat. Plus they've added this funnel to really force that heat from the fire into the wear chamber. And then we also found parts of the builder's trench for what we think is the wear chamber itself. In some places, there were foundation stones that were still nice and put together, but in other areas, there were really disheveled stones. So it looked like, once again, they were going through and they were kind of picking out what they could reuse and recycle. Now, the wear chamber itself is actually pretty small. So it's only about 4 feet deep, and we estimated about 6 feet wide. Now, when you compare that to the firing tunnel, you know, this thing's almost 10 feet long. What would be the advantage of having a small wear chamber? Well, one of the things that you could do with a smaller wear chamber is it allows you to control for uneven heating. So if you have a really big wear chamber, you're going to have spots in that wear chamber where you're going to have relatively cool spots and some areas where you have really hot spots. And that's going to affect the firing of your pottery. But if you have a smaller kiln, a smaller wear chamber, you will probably have more even heating throughout. Now, we looked and looked on the back of this kiln, and we looked for any evidence of a chimney on the back, and we couldn't find anything. Instead, what we found is what looks like a step that had been dug down into the clay subsoil at the back of this kiln. What we think is that they're probably loading and unloading the kiln from the back. We didn't see any good evidence of an access point on the sides. Instead, we got this stair step to the back of the kiln. And remember, this tunnel is so small, it's really not feasible to load your pottery through the fire tunnel. Rather, we think what they're doing is that they're creating a temporary opening in the back with the bricks, and they'll load all of the pottery back here, and then they brick up that opening right before they fire the kiln. They're starting this really big fire. It's coming into the wear chamber, and all that heat and smoke is probably going out through the top. Either maybe there was a chimney, or there might have been a vent hole, or multiple vent holes in the top. The last piece of evidence that suggests that this is a rear loading kiln. Remember earlier I talked about the 1793 experimental kiln and shed, and I said that it was capped by this work surface, really compacted dirt with a lot of little pieces of pottery that people had trampled.
Yes.
Well, we can actually follow that work surface from over top of the 1793 kiln all the way into the back of this kiln. So I think what's going on is as they're unloading, they're maybe dropping broken pieces of pottery, and then they're walking on top of it, and they're trampling and crushing up that pottery. So that would be the last piece of evidence that would suggest that this is a rear loading kiln. All right, so last but not least, you know, no archaeologist works on a project by themselves. And I am indebted to a number of volunteers and other professionals who have helped throughout the entire stage of this research. And so this is my way of acknowledging all of their hard work. And again, you know, I wouldn't know as much as I know about this particular project were it not for their help. So that's what I've got.
Yay! It's always good to see everybody that helped and worked on the project. I think that that's a very important part, and it's wonderful to be able to see all of them. We did have one question, and one last question, I think, which is they were asking to just specify again. I think I understood that it was the experimental kiln that was first associated with possible stoneware attempts. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And we see that in the historic records. We see that in, so we know that the master potter built this kiln in 1793. And then there is a meeting of the church board who's in charge of all the different trades in 1795. And they say, Rudolph Christ, who was the master potter at the time, has shown us a piece of successfully made stoneware.
That's
so
outstanding.
He's got the goods, and he takes it to the church and says, your investment has paid off.
So nice to have historic records for your archaeology.
Yep.
For the record, just in case anyone's wondering, not all archaeologists can have historic records that line up. But the Moravians are actually particularly well known for their record keeping.
They are, yes.
Yes.
So, and what that does is that allows us to kind of hit the ground running.
Yes.
To then pursue other questions.
Yes. That's awesome. Does anybody have any last questions for Geoffrey tonight? I'll wait just a second, just in case. Okay. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. You have done an amazing job. And just for everybody, thank you all for joining us today at today's webinar, Discovering Piedmont Archaeology, Fashioning and Firing Identities in the Moravian Society. Special thanks again to Professor Hughes from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro's Anthropology Department. I want to make sure to note for any community members that the wonderful archaeology program from UNCG and the UNCG Archaeology Club will be hosting Archaeology Day on October 16th with the Greensboro History Museum. This will be a wonderful program. So if you or someone you know is interested in learning more about archaeology in general or about the history that archaeology uncovers, this is the program for you. Also, thank you to our wonderful, all the wonderful people that help us make this possible and all of our wonderful audience. Your support makes all of this possible. Tune in on Tuesday, October 12th at 6 p.m. for our next webinar, Discovering Piedmont Archaeology, Colliding Worlds of Guilford County. And a quick note that our final webinar will actually be on a slightly different date than normal. It will be on a Thursday, October 21st at 6 p.m., kind of breaking our traditional Tuesdays. As always, attendance is free. However, please don't forget to register. Go to www.greensborohistory.org or the Greensboro History Museum's, I guess, Facebook or Instagram if they're up, and Twitter platforms to learn more. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening.